Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku replaced Peter Parker in the Avengers. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in downtown Mizudafa tasted of ozone, rain, and takoyaki. A chaotic symphony of scents for a chaotic Tuesday afternoon. For Izuku Midoriya, crouched behind the rusted chassis of an overturned delivery truck, it was the smell of a battlefield. Sirens wailed in the distance, a constant, mournful backdrop to the sharp, percussive sounds of the fight. Shattered glass glittered across the asphalt like malevolent diamonds, reflecting the neon glow of signs that still flickered defiantly. Villain analysis! Villain analysis! He muttered, his voice a low, frantic whisper that was lost in the din. His fingers, already aching with a familiar, deep-set throb, tightened their grip on his hero analysis for the future. Volume 13. The notebook was his shield, his codex, his anchor in the swirling madness of combat. Quirk appears to be spatial warping. Codename Vortex. Limited range, maybe 20 meters. Creates unstable, short-lived portals on flat surfaces. Not for transport, but for redirection. A volley of police bullets zipped past his cover, only to vanish into a shimmering, oil-slick distortion that had appeared on the side of a bus. A heartbeat later, the same bullets ripped out of a second portal on the pavement, tearing chunks from the undercarriage of the very truck Deku was hiding behind. He flinched, tucking his head down. Okay, so redirection is confirmed. He can't control what goes through, only where it comes out. Line of sight is likely required for portal placement. Weakness? The portals themselves. They shimmer, they're visible. And they seem to destabilize under pressure. The villain, a wiry man in a gaudy purple jumpsuit covered in swirling white spirals, cackled with manic glee. He danced between police barricades with an unnerving fluidity, his hands gesturing grandly as if conducting an orchestra of chaos. A swipe of his left hand, and a portal opened on the storefront of a department store. A flick of his right, and a chunk of debris hurled by a minor strength-based hero was swallowed by a warp on a lamppost, only to reappear and smash into the hero's own flank. Vortex wasn't powerful in the traditional sense. He was a tactical nightmare, turning his enemy's strength against them. Deku gritted his teeth. All Might would have ended this in an instant. A single, powerful gust of wind from a punch would have been enough to knock the man off his feet without needing to navigate the labyrinth of portals. But Deku wasn't All Might. He was a vessel, a leaky container for a power so immense it threatened to tear him apart with every use. He had a sledgehammer, but the world was full of keyholes. His gaze darted to the side, to a small family, a mother, a father, and a little girl clutching a plush rabbit, cowering in the alcove of a closed ramen shop. They were pinned down, directly in the line of fire between the police and Vortex. The villain hadn't noticed them yet. He was too busy enjoying his game. But it was only a matter of time. I have to do something. I have to draw his attention. Create an opening for the other heroes. His mind raced, flipping through strategies. A direct assault was suicide. Any punch he threw would be turned back on him. He needed to be faster than the portals. Or he needed to attack from an angle Vortex couldn't predict. Hey, Spyro Freak! A gruff voice shouted. It was the pro-hero, Death Arms, striding forward, his massive arms like twin battering rams. Your fun and games are over. Oh, are they? Vortex simpered, his grin widening. I think they're just getting started. Death Arms launched himself forward, aiming a powerful, straightforward punch. Deku's eyes widened in horror. No, it's a trap. He's baiting you. As predicted, a shimmering portal snapped into existence on the air directly in front of Vortex's chest. Death Arms' fist plunged into it. An instant later, a second portal opened up behind Death Arms' own head. His own devastating punch was about to knock himself out. There was no time to think. No time for a detailed plan. Just instinct. The primal, burning need to save. One for all. 5%! Deku whispered, the familiar green energy crackling to life around him, not in a full-body sheath, but focused, channeled, and desperate. He shot out from behind the truck, a green blur of motion. He didn't run towards Vortex. He ran parallel to the fight, His eyes locked on the space between Death's arms and his self-inflicted doom. He leaped, pushing off the ground with a controlled burst that still cracked the pavement beneath his feet. In midair, he drew back his right arm, the pain in his fingers a screaming premonition. He wouldn't aim at the villain. He wouldn't aim at the hero. He would aim at the air itself. Delaware! Smash! He flicked his middle finger, a seemingly minuscule gesture that unleashed a cannon blast of compressed air. It wasn't a 100% smash that could level a city block, but a focused, surgical strike of wind. The air bullet ripped through the space behind Death's arms, slamming into his redirected fist just a centimeter before it connected with his skull. The force was enough to shove Death's arm aside, sending him stumbling, confused but unharmed. A collective sigh of relief went through the onlooking police. Deku landed, skidding to a halt, his right hand screaming in protest. 2 fingers were a deep, ugly shade of purple and felt like they were packed with hot gravel. He ignored it, but he had overlooked one crucial detail. His analysis had been incomplete. The portals, they destabilize under pressure. His air pressure attack, while not hitting a portal directly, had passed right beside the main one Vortex was using. The shockwave had rippled through it. The shimmering oil-slick surface began to waver violently, like a reflection in a disturbed pond. It flickered, spasmed, and then began to expand, no longer a neat circle but a roiling, chaotic maw of distorted space. Vortex looked down at his creation, his smug grin melting into a mask of pure panic. No, no, no! It's collapsing. That's not supposed to happen. The expanding portal lost its flat, two-dimensional quality. It swelled outward, becoming a sphere of gravitational chaos. It began to pull. Debris, loose papers, and dust were sucked towards it. The pull intensified, becoming a furious wind. Deku dug his heels in, the soles of his reinforced boots groaning against the asphalt. He saw the family in the ramen shop alcove. The little girl's plush rabbit was ripped from her hands, vanishing into the vortex. The girl, crying, took a step after it, and the pull caught her. The mother screamed, grabbing her daughter's arm, but she too began to slide. Deku's heart hammered against his ribs. There was no choice. There was never a choice. He launched himself forward again, this time putting 5% into his legs. He moved like a thunderclap, covering the distance to the family in a fraction of a second. He grabbed the mother's arm, anchoring them. Get back! Inside the shop! Now! He roared over the howling vortex. He planted his feet, a human shield against the impossible physics tearing the street apart. The force was immense, pulling at him, trying to rip him from his footing. He could feel the sinews in his legs straining to their breaking point. Vortex, now caught in his own trap, shrieked as he was lifted off his feet. He tumbled through the air, his limbs flailing, before being consumed by the shimmering sphere. He was gone, but the vortex didn't disappear with him. It pulsed, a violent, final spasm. A wave of pure gravitational force erupted from it. Deku, his focus entirely on the family he was protecting, was caught completely off guard. His feet were torn from the ground. The world became a nauseating, colorless blur. He felt a sensation like being turned inside out, his atoms stretched across an infinite distance. His scream was silent, swallowed by the void. He saw a flash of his mother's face, of All Might's brilliant smile, of the UA high school gates. Then nothing. Just the crushing, absolute finality of blackness. Pain was the first herald of consciousness. A dull, throbbing bass line in his fingers, a sharp, stabbing treble in his head. The second was the smell. It was a suffocating cocktail of rotting garbage, stagnant water, and something acridly chemical, like industrial cleaner failing to mask a deeper filth. It was a stark, nauseating contrast to the familiar sense of Muzurifu. Izuku Midoriya's eyes fluttered open. The world was a smear of blurry shapes and muted colors. He was lying on his side, his cheek pressed against something cold, rough, and damp. Brick. He pushed himself up slowly, his body screaming in protest. His hero costume, his pride and joy, was torn at the shoulder and caked in a grime that felt ancient. His head swam, a dizzying vertigo that made the narrow space around him tilt and sway. He was in an alley. A disgustingly filthy one. A dented, overflowing dumpster stood against one wall, the source of the horrific smell. A single, bare bulb flickered pathetically under a rusted metal grate high above, casting long, distorted shadows. Rainwater trickled down the grimy brick walls, pooling in a puddle of iridescent filth near his feet. Where am I? His mind, usually a whirlwind of analysis and strategy, felt sluggish, coated in a thick fog. He remembered the fight. Vortex. The portal. The family. He had saved them, he was sure of that. But what happened after? He patted his pockets, his heart seizing with a jolt of panic. His fingers closed around the familiar, worn cover of his notebook. A wave of relief, so profound it almost made him weak nude, washed over him. He clutched it to his chest. Okay. He was okay. He still had his notebook. He staggered to his feet, using the wall for support. His 2 fingers on his right hand were a grotesque shade of swollen purple, but the bones felt like they were already knitting back together. One for all's passive healing factor, a small mercy in a sea of self-destruction. He stumbled towards the mouth of the alley, squinting against the dim light of what seemed to be a gray, overcast evening. He stepped out onto a sidewalk, and the world tilted again, this time not from dizziness, but from sheer, unadulterated shock. Everything was wrong. The buildings were different. Taller, somehow, and made of a darker, older stone. Ornate fire escapes zigzagged down their fronts, a feature he'd only ever seen in old movies. The cars were different, too, bulkier, with different shapes and logos he didn't recognize. But that wasn't the most jarring thing. It was the language. Every sign, every advertisement, every newspaper in a discarded bin was written in English. The glowing neon sign across the street didn't advertise pachinko or karaoke. It read, "O'Malley's Pub," the side of a passing bus declared. "See a show on Broadway, English." He breathed, his voice hoarse. He knew the language, of course. It was a required subject at UA. He could read it, speak it passably, but to be completely immersed in it, it was like waking up and finding the sky had turned green. It was fundamentally, existentially wrong. This has to be a quirk, he thought, his analytical mind desperately trying to impose order on the chaos. A villain's quirk. An illusion. A large-scale reality warp. It's the only explanation. He fumbled for his phone. He flipped it open, his thumb hovering over his mother's contact number. No signal. A cold dread, far deeper and more terrifying than any villain, began to creep up his spine. He tried again. And again. Nothing. Not a single bar. It was a dead brick in his hand. He looked around at the people bustling past him on the sidewalk. They were a sea of unfamiliar faces, speaking in a babble of English that was too fast, too accented for him to follow easily. They glanced at him, at his ridiculous green costume with its long, floppy ears, and then quickly looked away, their expressions ranging from amusement to mild alarm. He was a freak here. An oddity. In Japan, his costume, while unique, would have immediately marked him as a hero in training. People would have either cheered or offered help. Here, he just looked like a madman. Panic began to bubble in his chest, hot and acidic. He was alone. Truly, utterly alone. No All Might. No Uraraka or Ida. No mother to call. He was adrift in an ocean of wrongness, and his little island of familiarity had just sunk beneath the waves. He backed away, stumbling back into the relative anonymity of the alley. He slid down the brick wall, pulling his knees to his chest. The smell of garbage was a strange comfort, a sensory input he could focus on to keep from screaming. Think, Izuka, think. What would All Might do? All Might would not panic. All Might would assess the situation with a confident smile. He would find the villain responsible, and punch them so hard their quirk would unravel. But Deku couldn't find a villain. He couldn't find a clue. All he could find was evidence that he was, impossibly, somewhere he shouldn't be. Was this another country? America, maybe? Had Vortex's quirk thrown him across the entire planet? It seemed more likely than the alternative, the one that tickled at the edges of his rational mind, the one that came from all the pre-quirk comic books he'd read as a child. The idea of another dimension. Another Earth. He shook his head, burying his face in his knees. No. No, that's crazy. That's impossible. But the evidence was all around him. The architecture, the language, the complete and total lack of a signal connecting him to his home. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force the panic down. Crying wouldn't help. He was a hero. He had to act like one, even if he was terrified. Okay. First step, gather information. Observe. Understand the rules of this place. Find out where here is. Second step, find a way home. It was a flimsy plan, a straw in a hurricane, but it was something. It was a mission. And a hero with a mission could function. He took out his notebook, his hands shaking so badly it was hard to hold the pen. He flipped to a clean page and, with a wobbly hand, wrote at the top, Analysis, Unknown Location. He began to write, his familiar habit a calming ritual. Atmosphere, breathable. Standard nitrogen-oxygen mix, seemingly. No immediate toxins. Gravity, feels normal. Approximately 9.8 meters per square second. Local population, seemingly all baseline human. No visible mutations or heteromorphic quirks. This last point gave him pause. In Musudafu, you couldn't walk a block without seeing someone with a minor visible quirk, slightly elongated fingers, oddly colored skin, small horns. Here? Nothing. Everyone looked normal. It was unsettling. Was this a place without quirks? A sharp scream cut through his thoughts, slicing through the ambient city noise. It was close. A woman's voice, high-pitched with terror. Deku's head snapped up. The sound had come from the other end of the alley, deeper in the darkness. Every fiber of his being, every lesson from All Might, every ounce of his heroic DNA screamed at him to move. But a cold, rational part of his brain hesitated. You don't know the laws here. Using your quirk without a license is a serious crime in Japan. What if it's worse here? You're injured. You're alone. You could make things worse. Another scream, this one choked off into a whimper. The debate was over before it had truly begun. He could be arrested. He could be misunderstood. He could be thrown in a foreign prison, but he could not, would not, stand by and do nothing while someone was in danger. That was the one line he would never cross. He pushed himself to his feet, the aches and pains of his body momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He moved deeper into the alley, his soft-soled boots making almost no sound on the grimy pavement. He rounded a corner formed by another large dumpster, and saw them. Two men, burly and dressed in ragged hoodies, had a young woman pinned against the wall. One had her by the arms, his grubby hand clamped over her mouth. The other was trying to rip the purse from her shoulder. She was kicking and struggling, her eyes wide with terror. Just give us the bag, lady, and we won't have to get rough. The second man growled, his voice a low, gravelly threat. Deku's blood ran cold, then hot. Rage, pure and righteous, burned away the last vestiges of his fear and confusion. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have his license. All he had was a burning imperative. He stepped out of the shadows. Hey, he said, his voice coming out stronger and steadier than he expected. Leave her alone. The two men turned, their expressions shifting from predatory aggression to surprised contempt. They took in his appearance. The torn, dirty green suit, the absurd rabbit-ear cowl, the earnest, determined look on his young face. The one holding the woman's purse let out a bark of laughter. Or what, bunny boy? He sneered, pulling a grimy switchblade from his pocket. The blade snapped open with a menacing click. You gonna hop away? Deku's eyes narrowed. A knife. Okay. This was serious. He needed to end this fast, before the woman or he got hurt. He needed to be precise. Non-lethal. Disarm and incapacitate. A quick, focused burst of power, just like he'd practiced with Gran Torino. A simple flick of the finger to knock the knife away. Simple. He raised his left hand, his index finger pointed at the man with the knife. He focused, trying to channel the barest whisper of one for all. Just a tiny fraction. Less than 1%. Enough to create a puff of air. But his control, always a precarious thing, was shattered by the adrenaline, the pain, and the deep-seated terror of his situation. In that split second, as he flicked his finger, his mental floodgates buckled. For a microsecond, What felt like a tidal wave of power surged into that tiny digit. Not 1%. Not even 5%. It was an uncontrolled, uncalibrated spike of the raw, world-breaking force of one for all. He didn't produce a puff of air. The sound was like a thunderclap in the enclosed space. A white-hot line of force, visible for a fraction of a second as a distortion in the air, erupted from his fingertip. It struck the man with the knife not in the hand, but dead center in the chest. The result was cataclysmic. The man didn't just get knocked back. He was launched, a human cannonball, his feet leaving the ground instantly. He flew the entire 10-foot width of the alley, his back slamming into the opposing brick wall with a sickening, wet crunch. The impact was so violent it didn't just knock him unconscious. It created a spiderweb of cracks in the solid brickwork around his body. He slid down to the ground, a crumpled, unmoving heap. Silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the drip of water and the distant, oblivious city. The second mugger stared, his jaw hanging open. He looked from his fallen comrade, embedded in the wall, to Deku's outstretched finger. His eyes were wide with a primal terror that transcended language. He dropped the woman's arm as if she were on fire, let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeak, and scrambled away, disappearing into the darkness like a frightened rat. Deku stood frozen, his own arm still outstretched. He slowly lowered it, his gaze fixed on the devastation he had wrought. He looked at his finger. It was fine. No pain, no purple bruising. The power had passed through too quickly to break the bone. Then he looked at the man on the ground. The cracked wall. The sheer, unholy violence of the act. His heart, which had been hammering with adrenaline, now seemed to stop entirely. A cold wave of nausea and horror washed over him. He hadn't meant to do that. He had tried to be careful. He had tried to be a hero. I could have killed him. The thought was a physical blow. He staggered back, a choked gasp escaping his lips. He was a monster. A reckless, uncontrolled force of destruction. He had analyzed heroes his whole life, dreamed of their precision, their control, their unwavering ability to save without causing undue harm. And in his first real act in this new world, he had failed in the most spectacular way possible. The young woman, now free, didn't thank him. She stared at him with the same terror as the mugger who had fled. She scrambled to grab her purse, her eyes never leaving him, as if he were the real threat. Then she too ran, her footsteps echoing down the alley as she fled the scene, fled him. He was alone again. Alone with the consequences of his power. He fell to his knees, the dirty puddle soaking through the fabric of his costume. He looked at his hands, no longer seeing the tools of a hero, but the clumsy, world-breaking weapons of a monster. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the unconscious man, to the empty alley, to the city that didn't know him. "I'm so sorry." High above the grime and desperation of Queens, in the pristine, climate-controlled quiet of the Avengers compound, Tony Stark swirled amber liquid in a crystal glass. The view from his workshop window was a panoramic masterpiece of upstate New York's lush greenery, a serene landscape that did little to soothe the frantic buzzing in his own head. The ghosts of Sokovia and the Chitauri invasion were loud tonight, whispering premonitions of a threat he couldn't see, a war he was destined to lose. His vision from Wanda Maximoff, the dead Avengers, the alien armada, Captain America's broken shield and final, accusing words, was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. It was the driving force behind everything. The Iron Legion. Ultron. And now, the Sokovia Accords. A suit of armor around the world. That was the goal. Control. Accountability. Anything to prevent that apocalyptic future. "Another late night, boss?" A calm, synthesized female voice echoed from the ceiling. "My diagnostics indicate your sleep cycle is suboptimal by 47%. File it under acceptable losses, Friday," Tony quipped, taking a small sip of his ridiculously expensive scotch. "The world needs watching, and I'm the only one with the bandwidth." He gestured to a holographic display hovering in the center of the room. It showed a complex global map, overlaid with 1,000 points of data, energy readings, communications chatter, satellite surveillance. It was his personal, planetary-scale nervous system. "Run the threat analysis again." Cross-reference any anomalous energy signatures from the last 72 hours with known Hydra splinter cells and any tech that went missing from the Triskelion. Running analysis now, boss, Friday replied. The map shimmered, data points blinking and shifting. No significant correlations found. Global threat level remains at a steady low-grade simmering chaos. Tony sighed, running a hand through his hair. Great. My favorite flavor of chaos. He was about to dismiss the display when a sudden, jarring alert klaxon blared through the workshop. A single point on the holographic map, right over Queens, flashed a violent, angry red. Whoa, what's that? Tony said, setting his glass down with a sharp click. Sir, an unidentified energy signature has just manifested in Queens. Friday's voice was stripped of its usual placid tone, now laced with a synthetic urgency. The output is anomalous. Anomalous how? Alien? Magical? Please don't say magical. I'm still not over the whole Cape and Sparkles routine. It's difficult to classify, sir. The signature is biological in origin, but the power spike was instantaneous and immense. For a duration of 0.02 seconds, it peaked at a level comparable to the Hulk during his initial transformation. Tony froze. The Scotch was completely forgotten. The name hung in the air, a four-letter word for uncontrollable destruction. The Hulk. Comparable to the Hulk, he repeated slowly, the words tasting like ash. In the middle of Queens. Friday, give me visuals. Satellites, traffic cams, anything you can hack into. Accessing local feeds now. There's significant signal interference around the source, like a localized EMP. But I'm getting a heat signature. It's concentrated in an alleyway off 42nd Street. Tony was already moving. The ghosts in his head were screaming now. An uncatalogued, Hulk-level event happening without warning in a civilian population center was the literal embodiment of his worst fears. This was exactly what the Accords were for. This was a fire that had to be put out before it could spread. Get me the Mark 46, he commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. Full combat diagnostics. Non-lethal ordnance loaded first, but I want vibranium-piercing rounds on standby. Understood, boss. Gantries and robotic arms descended from the ceiling, a familiar mechanical ballet beginning around him. Plates of red and gold metal snapped into place over his clothes. The arc reactor in his chest glowed to life, powering the most advanced weaponized suit on the planet. He felt the reassuring weight settle over him, the hum of its systems a familiar comfort. Friday, what's the status on the energy source? He asked as the helmet slid into place, his vision replaced by the blue-tinted heads-up display. The spike has dissipated, sir. Current energy readings are negligible, consistent with a baseline human in a state of distress. It just turned off? That was even stranger. The Hulk didn't have an off switch. What's the collateral? Minimal, from what I can see, Friday reported. One unconscious male with significant blunt force trauma, and what appears to be structural damage to a brick wall. No other casualties reported. The source of the energy signature is still in the alley. Heart rate is elevated. He appears to be panicking. Tony's brow furrowed inside the helmet. A Hulk-level power burst with minimal collateral and an off switch. A target that was panicking. This wasn't adding up to a monster. It was adding up to something new, something unknown, and Tony Stark hated the unknown more than anything. The final plate locked into his back. The thrusters in his boots and gauntlets ignited with a low whump. All right, he said, his voice now the familiar, tinny baritone of Iron Man. Let's go meet the new kid on the block. He rose into the air, hovering for a moment in the center of his workshop. Then, with a concussive blast of energy, he shot out through the open bay doors, a red and gold comet streaking through the night sky. He was a suit of armor, flying towards a fire, determined to contain it, no matter the cost. He was heading for a dirty alley in Queens, to confront an anomaly that had the power of a god and, apparently, the heart of a frightened child. The silence in the alley was a thick, heavy blanket, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic wail of a siren growing steadily fainter. Izuka Midoriya remained on his knees in the filthy puddle, the cold seeping into his bones, a feeling utterly dwarfed by the glacial ice flooding his veins. He stared at the man he had struck, a crumpled shape against the spiderweb of cracked brick. The man's chest was rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. He was alive. The relief that washed over Deku was so potent it was nauseating. He hadn't killed him. The thought was a lifeline in an ocean of self-recrimination. But the horror remained, a coiling serpent in his gut. The sheer, unrestrained violence of the act, the chasm between his intent and the result, was a terrifying testament to the monster lurking within him. The beast called one for all that he was failing so spectacularly to tame. He was so lost in his spiral of shame that he didn't hear the approach. There was no sound of footsteps, no whisper of movement. There was only a sudden, sharp drop in the ambient temperature, and the sound of something heavy and metallic landing on the pavement at the alley's mouth. It was a sound of immense weight, perfectly controlled, like a bank vault being set gently on a marble floor. Deku's head snapped up. His breath hitched. Framed by the grimy opening of the alley, silhouetted against the lurid, neon-bled glow of the city, stood a figure of impossible familiarity. It was taller than he'd imagined, broader in the shoulders. The iconic armor of crimson and gold gleamed even in the dim light, catching the flicker of a distant street lamp on its polished faceplate. The arc reactor in its chest pulsed with a soft, steady blue light, a beacon of otherworldly technology. It was Iron Man. The world seemed to thin around Deku, the air growing sharp and brittle in his lungs. His mind, already reeling from the dimensional displacement, simply broke. This wasn't a hero. This was a comic book character. A movie star. A piece of beloved fiction from his world, a world that now felt impossibly, heartbreakingly far away. To see him standing there, real and solid and impossibly present, was a violation of the fundamental laws of reality, as he knew them. "Don't move," the voice commanded. It was synthesized, metallic, and yet held the unmistakable cadence of the man he'd seen in movies, the billionaire genius Tony Stark. "Hands where I can see them." Deku couldn't have moved if he'd wanted to. His limbs were locked, his muscles turned to stone. His brain was a frantic mess of error messages and blue screens. He was staring at a ghost, a myth made manifest. The notebook full of hero analysis felt like a useless, childish relic in the face of this. How could you analyze something that wasn't supposed to exist? Iron Man took a slow, deliberate step into the alley. A whir of servos accompanied the movement. His glowing blue eyes swept the scene, the HUD inside his helmet processing every detail at the speed of thought. One unconscious male, vitals weak but stable. Multiple fractures, severe blunt force trauma. Structural damage to load-bearing wall, localized impact point. And the source. His gaze settled on Deku. Thermal scans showed a boy's physique under the strange green costume. Heart rate was through the roof. Adrenaline and cortisol levels were sky-high. He was reading pure, unadulterated panic. This wasn't a monster. This was a terrified kid who had just set off a bomb he didn't know he was holding. "Aye." Deku stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. Words, both Japanese and English, collided in his throat and came out as nothing. He instinctively raised his hands, palms open, a universal gesture of surrender. One hand was still swollen and purplish from the fight with Vortex, the other perfectly fine, yet somehow more terrifying for it. "Easy, kid. Just take it easy." Tony's voice softened slightly, a tactical shift. The kid was on the verge of a complete breakdown. The last thing he needed was for him to have another episode and accidentally level a city block. "You speak English?" "Nod if you speak English." Deku managed a jerky, spastic nod, his wide, tear-filled green eyes locked on the impassive gold faceplate. "Good. That's a start." Iron Man took another step, his sensors doing a passive scan of Deku's body. The readings were nonsensical. The energy was gone. Completely. There was no exotic radiation, no identifiable power source. It was like trying to find the scorch mark of a lightning strike after the storm had passed. "I'm not here to hurt you, but you and I need to have a conversation. Preferably somewhere that isn't a biohazard." His gaze flicked to the unconscious mugger. With a tap on his gauntlet, he discreetly sent an anonymous tip to the local paramedics and police, giving them the location and a heavily redacted report of a gang-related assault. He needed to sanitize the scene. He needed to get this kid off the board before anyone else knew he existed. "We're going for a little flight," Iron Man stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Deku's eyes widened further, if that were even possible. "A flight?" Before he could protest, Iron Man moved with startling speed. He crossed the remaining distance, scooped Deku up in one arm as if he weighed nothing, and with a powerful blast from his boot thrusters, shot straight up into the sky. The world dissolved into a vertiginous blur. The alley, the city, the entire concept of solid ground vanished beneath them. Deku let out a choked cry, instinctively clinging to the cold, unyielding metal of the armor. The wind roared past him, a physical force that stole the air from his lungs. They burst through the low-hanging cloud cover and into the vast, open night. Below them, New York City spread out like a circuit board of infinite, glittering lights. It was a breathtaking, terrifying vista. This wasn't Tokyo. It wasn't Mizutofu. It was a place he recognized only from postcards and films, a city that belonged to a different story, a different world. The reality of it, seen from this impossible height, was the final nail in the coffin of his denial. He was lost. Impossibly, completely lost. He was being carried through the sky by a fictional character, away from the scene of his own monstrous mistake, and every foot they traveled was a foot further from home. The journey was a silent, high-speed blur. Deku was too overwhelmed to speak, and Tony was too busy running scenarios in his head. They flew over the East River, leaving the dense metropolis behind for the dark, wooded expanse of upstate New York. Soon, a sprawling, ultra-modern complex of glass and steel came into view, nestled in a clearing and glowing with a soft, internal light. The Avengers compound. Tony landed as gently as he had taken off, touching down on a wide, circular platform. The night air was clean and crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was a world away from the alley. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere," Tony's voice announced as his faceplate retracted, revealing the familiar, world-weary face of Tony Stark. His expression was a mixture of concern, intense curiosity, and the tightly wound stress of a man who hadn't had a good night's sleep in years. "Try not to break anything in here. It's all very expensive." Deku was gently set on his feet. He stumbled, his legs like jelly. He stared at Tony Stark's actual, real-life face. The goatee. The tired, intelligent eyes. It was too much. He felt a wave of dizziness, and swayed on his feet. "Whoa, easy there, Peter Pan," Tony said, steadying him with a hand on his shoulder. "Let's get you inside before you pass out." He led the shell-shocked teenager through a set of sliding glass doors into a vast, open-plan living area. The decor was minimalist, expensive, and intimidatingly clean. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out into the dark woods. A sleek, modern kitchen sat at one end, and plush, uncomfortable-looking couches were arranged in the center. It felt less like a home and more like a high-tech showroom. "Friday, lock down the West Wing. No entry or exit without my authorization," Tony commanded to the empty air. "Lockdown protocol engaged, boss," the disembodied female voice replied from hidden speakers, making Deku jump. Who was that?" He stammered. "My assistant, Friday. She's an AI. She runs the place," Tony explained casually, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. He gestured towards a stark, white room off the main hall. "In here. We need to talk." The room was an interrogation chamber, softened by Stark's aesthetic. Instead of a cold metal table, there was a sleek obsidian one. The chairs were ergonomic but uninviting. The walls were a soft gray, but Deku had no doubt they were reinforced with something far stronger than steel. The doors slid shut behind them with a heavy, final thump. Tony sat down opposite him, steepling his fingers. "Okay. Let's start with the basics. Name: M. Midoriya." "Izuku Midoriya," Deku managed, his voice barely a whisper. He instinctively hunched his shoulders, making himself smaller. "Midoriya," Tony repeated, testing the name. "And the green bunny suit? Is that like a team mascot thing?" It's my hero costume," Deku said, a faint spark of indignation cutting through his fear. "The ears are modeled after my mentor, All Might." He trailed off, realizing how insane that must sound. Tony raised an eyebrow. "All Might. Right. I'll add him to the Christmas card list." Now, let's talk about what happened in that alley. You want to explain to me how you punched a man through a brick wall with what looked like a finger flick? Deku's face crumpled. I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to. I just wanted to knock the knife out of his hand. My power. I can't control it very well yet. It's too strong. Your power, Tony said, leaning forward. Let's talk about that. What is it? Is it tech? A genetic mutation? Did you fall into a vat of radioactive something? This was it. The impossible explanation. Deku took a shaky breath. It's a quirk. A quirk, Tony said flatly. Like a personality trait? No. A quirk. A superpower. Where I come from, almost everyone has one. It started generations ago. Now, about 80% of the population has some kind of special ability. Tony stared at him, his expression unreadable. He tapped his finger on the table. Friday, scan all known global databases, cross-reference quirk, all might, and any records of a widespread emergence of superhuman abilities. A moment of silence. Scan complete, boss. Friday's voice filled the room. 0 results found. Deku's heart sank. Of course. It was more proof. Okay, kid. So you're from a magical fairy tale land where everyone has superpowers, Tony said, his voice dripping with skepticism. And what's your special power? Super strength? It's called one for all, Deku said, his voice gaining a little strength as he spoke of something so sacred to him. It's a stockpiling quirk. It can be passed down from one person to another, like a sacred torch. I inherited it. It gets stronger with each new user. Tony leaned back in his chair, a slow, wry smile spreading across his face. A sacred torch. You're serious? You actually believe that? He looked like he was about to laugh, to dismiss the whole thing as the delusion of a traumatized kid. Boss, Friday interjected, her tone clinical. I have completed the passive medical scan of Mr. Midoriya. And? Tony asked, still looking at Deku. What's the diagnosis? Acute case of fantasy-prone personality? Negative. His physiology is, for all intents and purposes, baseline human. Cellular structure is unremarkable. However, the potential energy analysis is confounding. His body's mitochondrial output is normal, yet my projections based on the residual energy from the alley event indicate his body is capable of generating and releasing kinetic energy on a scale that violates the first law of thermodynamics. There is no identifiable power source. The energy seems to manifest from nowhere. Tony's smile vanished. He turned his full attention to the ceiling, as if looking at Friday herself. Run that again. The subject's power output has no discernible source, boss. It's a physical impossibility. According to our current understanding of physics, he should not be able to do what you saw him do. Tony fell silent, his gaze returning to Deku with a newfound, unnerving intensity. The skepticism was gone, replaced by the voracious curiosity of a scientist who had just stumbled upon a brand new, impossible law of nature. A stockpiling quirk, Tony murmured, more to himself than to Deku. Passed down. Getting stronger each time. He looked at Deku's injured right hand, then at the left one that had done the damage. You said you can't control it. What happens when you use it? My body can handle the recoil, Deku explained, glad to be on slightly more solid ground. If I use it at 100%, it breaks my bones. I'm learning to regulate it, to use smaller percentages, but sometimes I get it wrong. You get it wrong, Tony repeated, his mind racing. So the choice is between a flick that sends a man through a wall, or a full power punch that turns your own arm into dust. That's not a power, kid, that's a design flaw. You're a bomb with a faulty trigger. He stood up and began to pace the room, the gears in his brain turning at a furious pace. A kid from another dimension. A power that defied physics, raw strength that rivaled the Hulk, but with a catastrophic, self-destructive side effect. It was the most dangerous and fascinating thing he had ever encountered. As Tony paced, Deku fumbled in the utility pouches on his belt. His fingers closed around his notebook. He pulled it out, holding it in his lap like a security blanket. It was his last piece of home, his one constant in this maelstrom of insanity. Tony noticed the movement. What's that? More notes from fairyland? Deku flinched at the sarcasm, but clutched the book tighter. It's my analysis notebook. Analysis of what? Tony asked, stopping his pacing to lean over the table. His curiosity piqued again. Of heroes, Deku said softly. Their quirks. Their fighting styles. Their strengths and weaknesses. Tony let out a short, sharp laugh. Kid, I live with heroes. I am a hero. What could you possibly know that I don't? He reached out and, with a gentle but firm motion, plucked the notebook from Deku's hands. Deku made a small noise of protest, but it was too late. Tony Stark was flipping through Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. His initial expression was one of bored amusement. He saw the childish, yet surprisingly detailed, drawings of costumed figures Deku had made. He saw pages and pages of dense, frantic Japanese script. Cute, he muttered, about to toss it back on the table. Friday, humor me. Translate the page he's got open there. The big guy with the weird hair. Translating now, boss. Tony's eyes scanned the page as Friday's translation appeared on his internal HUD, overlaid on the text. Hero, all might. Quirk, unknown presumed strength enhancer 1 for all. Analysis. Primary fighting style relies on overwhelming force and shockwave generation via air pressure. C. Texas Smash, Detroit Smash. Effective against large targets and for crowd control. Major weakness, a clear time limit on his powered form. Observable signs of strain after prolonged exertion. Potential vulnerability to high speed, attrition-based opponents who can outlast his timer. Also exhibits a psychological blind spot for anything he cannot punch directly. Favors left side attacks, possible residual injury on his right? Further observation required. Tony's amusement evaporated. He flipped the page. Hero Endeavor. Quirk Hellflame. Analysis. Mastery of thermokinesis is unparalleled. Capable of focused plasma jets and wide-area incendiary blasts. Weakness, prone to overheating. Sustained use of maximum power leads to a measurable decrease in speed and cognitive function. Relies heavily on intimidation and brute force. Highly susceptible to psychological warfare. His temper is a weapon that can be used against him. Coordinated attacks from multiple angles could overwhelm his defenses. Tony flipped again. And again. Page after page, it was the same. Eraserhead. Best Genist. Mount Lady. Heroes he had never heard of, powers he couldn't imagine, all broken down with a terrifyingly clinical, ruthless efficiency. This wasn't a fanbase scrapbook. This was professional-grade threat assessment. It was the kind of work Natasha Romanoff did in her sleep. It was the kind of work he did when he designed contingency plans for the Avengers. He slowly closed the notebook, the cover bearing the singed marks from the earlier fight. He looked at Izuku Midoriya, and for the first time, he didn't see a lost kid or a walking bomb. He saw a mind. A brilliant, strategic, analytical mind trapped in the body of a boy who possessed the power of a god. The combination was staggering. You did all this? Tony asked, his voice quiet, stripped of all sarcasm. Deku nodded meekly. I've always wanted to be a hero. It helps me to think about how they work. Tony placed the notebook carefully on the table, as if it were a priceless artifact. He sat back down, his entire demeanor changed. The situation had just been upgraded from dangerous anomaly to unprecedented asset. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, fixing Deku with a look of profound seriousness. Okay, Izuku Midoriya from the land of quirks. You're in a tough spot. You're a long way from home, you've got no money, no ID, and a power that could get you dissected by some very unpleasant people in black suits if they ever found out about you. Deku swallowed hard, the truth of Tony's words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. You need a place to stay, Tony continued, his voice low and persuasive. A place where you can be safe. Where you won't hurt anyone, and no one will hurt you. You need food, medical care for that self-destructive habit of yours. And you need resources. People who can help you understand what you are, maybe even help you control it. He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. It was everything Deku needed, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I can give you all of that, Tony said softly. I can give you a home. I can give you a chance to learn. A chance to be the hero you've got detailed in that little book of yours. Deku's eyes filled with tears, this time not of fear, but of a desperate, burgeoning hope. Really? Really, Tony confirmed. Then came the turn. But I need something from you in return. The hope in Deku's eyes flickered, replaced by caution. My friends and I, Tony began, choosing his words with surgical precision, we're having a disagreement. A philosophical one. About how we do our job. About accountability. Some of us believe that heroes, with all our power, can't just be a law unto ourselves. We believe we need oversight, to make sure something like what happened in Sokovia never happens again. He was painting a simple picture of a complex war. He was framing himself as the voice of reason and responsibility, something he knew a boy obsessed with the rules and regulations of heroism would respond to. My best friend, Steve Rogers, Captain America, he disagrees, Tony continued, his voice laced with a carefully crafted sadness. He's a good man. The best. But he's stubborn. He believes that the safest hands are still our own. He's choosing to operate outside the law, to protect another friend of his who's complicated. And I can't let him. I have to stop him, to bring him in, before he does something that fractures the Avengers for good. Before someone gets seriously hurt. Deku listened, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was processing it through the lens of his own world. Hero laws. The Commission. The importance of licensed, sanctioned hero work. From his perspective, Tony's argument was the only logical one. A hero operating outside the law, no matter how good their intentions, was a vigilante. And vigilantes were dangerous. What do you need me to do? Deku asked, his voice barely audible. Tony looked him straight in the eye. I need your help. Steve is bringing friends. I need to bring friends too. I need you to stand with me. To help me show him that he's on the wrong path. It won't be a real fight. Just a disagreement between colleagues. A way to get him to sit down and talk. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, wrapped in the comforting blanket of logic and righteousness. He was asking a child to be his trump card in a war, but framing it as a simple intervention. Deku looked down at his notebook, at the drawings of his heroes, of All Might. All Might was the ultimate symbol of sanctioned heroism. He worked with the police. He followed the rules. He was a pillar of the society he protected. What would All Might do? He would surely side with the person advocating for law and order, for accountability. Slowly, hesitantly, Izuku Midoriya nodded. Okay, he whispered. If it will help. I'll help you. A thin, triumphant smile touched Tony Stark's lips. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a look of paternal reassurance. Good. That's good, kid. You're doing the right thing. He stood up, the interview concluded. Friday, show Mr. Midoriya to guest suite 7. Get him a change of clothes and a full medical workup. Priority 1 is analyzing that arm. As Deku was led out of the room by a small, hovering drone, Tony remained behind. He picked up the notebook again, flipping through its pages. He saw the raw power in the alley. He saw the brilliant, analytical mind in these pages. He saw a scared, naive, desperately heroic kid who would do anything for a person he saw as a mentor. He had his solution. The fight with Steve was coming. It was going to be ugly. But now, Tony had an ace up his sleeve. A secret weapon Steve would never see coming. A kid who could hit with the force of a demigod. He's a nuke, Tony thought, the cold calculation overriding the faint twinge of guilt. And sometimes, to prevent a war, you have to show the other side you have a nuke. He closed the notebook and walked out of the room, the weight of the future he was trying to control settling even more heavily on his shoulders. The guest suite wasn't just a room. It was larger than the entire Midoriya apartment back in Muzurifu. The bed was a cloud of white linen and impossibly soft pillows, big enough for 4 people to sleep in without touching. One wall was a solid pane of glass that looked out onto a serene, manicured garden where robotic lawnmowers hummed in quiet diligence. The closet was pre-filled with an assortment of plain, comfortable clothes, soft t-shirts, sweatpants, and hoodies, all in his size, a feat of logistics that felt both miraculous and deeply unsettling. For 3 days, this luxurious cage was Izuku Midoriya's entire world. He barely left it. The shock of his transdimensional kidnapping had subsided, replaced by a deep, hollow ache of homesickness and annoying, ever-present anxiety. He would sit on the edge of the ridiculously large bed, his hero costume, now cleaned and repaired by an unseen hand, folded neatly on a chair. He'd stare at it, a tangible link to a life that felt like a fading dream. He missed the familiar chime of the UA school bell. He missed Urarika's cheerful, floating laugh and Ida's rigid, chopping hand gestures. Most of all, he missed his mother's worried face and her katsudon, the taste of home and unconditional love. He spent most of his waking hours with his notebook. But he wasn't writing new entries. He was poring over old ones, a scholar studying a dead language. The world of quirks, of all might and endeavor, felt the universe away, because it was. His analysis, once a tool for a future he was building, now felt like an epitaph for a past he might never reclaim. His primary companions were automated. Drones delivered his meals, delicious, nutritionally balanced food he barely tasted. A medical drone, a friendly, hovering puck of white plastic, would visit 3 times a day to scan his arm. The speed of his healing was, according to Friday's disembodied voice, an unprecedented cellular regeneration rate, exceeding even baseline projections for subjects with enhanced healing factors. His broken fingers from the Vortex fight were now just a faint memory of a deep ache. He was a medical marvel, a biological paradox, and a very lonely teenage boy. On the 4th day, Tony Stark decided it was time to bring him into the fold. "Morning, Kermit!" Tony's voice chirped from a speaker in the wall, making Deku jump. "Field trip time. Meet me in Lab 3 in 5 minutes. And try to look less like you're waiting for a bus to the apocalypse." Deku, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and black sweatpants, obeyed. He navigated the sterile, white corridors of the compound, his soft-soled sneakers silent on the polished concrete floors. The place felt less like a home base and more like a high-tech hospital where the only patient was the world itself. Lab 3 was a cavern of organized chaos. Holographic displays flickered with complex schematics. Robotic arms sat dormant in their stations. In the center of the room stood 2 figures. One was Colonel James Rhodes, his face etched with a military man's stern discipline, though his eyes held a weary concern as he looked at Deku. The other figure stopped Deku dead in his tracks. It was not human. It was tall and slender, with skin the color of magenta, clad in a flowing, regal-looking gray suit with a golden cape. A glowing yellow gem, the Mind Stone, was embedded in its forehead, pulsing with a gentle, inner light. It was the Vision. Deku had seen news clips, grainy footage of the battle in Sokovia. Seeing him in person was, once again, like seeing a page from a storybook walk into the room. "Midoriya, this is Colonel Rhodes, also known as War Machine. And the synthesis in the cape is Vision," Tony said, gesturing with a Stark-branded tablet. "Team, this is Izuku Midoriya. He's our new intern. He's going to be helping us out with the Captain America situation." Rhodey's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked Deku up and down, the scrawny frame, the nervous energy, the sheer, unadulterated youth. "Tony, can I talk to you for a second?" he said, his voice low. He pulled Tony aside, just out of earshot. "An intern? He's a kid. He looks like he should be worried about his calculus homework, not getting into a brawl with a super soldier. He's more than a kid, Rhodey. He's a tactical nuke," Tony countered, his voice a low, intense whisper. "You saw the energy readings from Queens. If things go south at that airport, I'd rather have a nuke on our side than pointed at us. Nukes are indiscriminate, Tony. They leave a mess." Rhodey shot back, his gaze flickering over to Deku, who was now standing awkwardly, trying not to stare at the Mind Stone. "He doesn't look like a soldier. He looks scared." "He is scared," Tony admitted. "That's what makes him safe. He's afraid of his own power. He won't use it unless he absolutely has to. He's a deterrent, not a frontline combatant. Trust me." Rhodey didn't look convinced, but he let it drop, giving a curt, professional nod to Deku. Vision, however, glided forward. His movements were perfectly silent and fluid. He stopped a few feet from Deku, his glowing eyes studying the boy with an unnerving, analytical calm. "Your biosignature is fascinating, Izuku Midoriya. Vision stated, his voice a melodic, synthesized baritone. It was calm, curious, and utterly devoid of judgment. My senses perceive a vast, kinetic potential within you, yet it remains inert. A dormant volcano. I am curious as to the nature of its trigger. Deku stared, mesmerized and intimidated. It's my quirk, he stammered, falling back on the only explanation he had. It's called one for all, Vision repeated, tilting his head. The Mind Stone glowed a little brighter. A curious designation. It implies a collective, a legacy. Yet it resides within a single individual. A paradox. He offered a small, serene smile. I too am a paradox. I hope we can learn from one another. Deku could only nod, completely overwhelmed. This being was born of an infinity stone, a cosmic force he couldn't begin to comprehend. And it was talking to him about paradoxes. All right, playtime's over, Tony announced, clapping his hands together. Time to get our intern geared up. Friday, bring up Project Greenstick. A massive holographic display flickered to life, showing a 3D model of Deku's body, surrounded by complex stress analysis charts and energy flow diagrams. Now, Tony began, pacing in front of the display like a professor giving a lecture. The initial impulse is to build you a suit. Something like mine. Armor. But we have a problem. He gestured to the screen, and a simulation ran. A virtual suit of titanium gold alloy formed around the model of Deku. Then, the model's arm glowed with a furious red energy. It threw a punch. The virtual suit didn't just buckle. It disintegrated. The arm, and the armor around it, was shredded into 1,000,000 pieces from the inside out. The kinetic blowback from a 100% output is astronomical, Tony said, stating the obvious. The force required to punch a man through a wall is one thing, but the reactive force on your own body is just as powerful. It's Newton's third law on steroids. Any armor we build for you wouldn't be protecting you from the enemy. It would be protecting you from yourself. And frankly, there isn't a material on Earth short of pure vibranium that could withstand that kind of internal force without turning into shrapnel. Deku stared at the simulation, a cold knot of fear tightening in his stomach. He knew his quirk was destructive to his body, but seeing it laid out in such stark, scientific terms was horrifying. So, Tony continued, we're not going to try and contain the explosion. We're going to try and manage the fallout. He swiped the screen, and a new design appeared. It wasn't a suit of armor. It was a series of sleek, black and dark green braces. They were intricately designed, with what looked like pistons, gyroscopic stabilizers, and a complex network of woven fibers. This is not an offensive weapon system, Tony explained, zooming in on a brace designed for Deku's right arm. This is the most advanced shock absorption system ever created. Think of it as a brace and a cast, all in one. The outer shell is a carbon polymer composite, lightweight but incredibly durable. The inner lining is a non-Newtonian gel that stiffens on impact. But the real magic is the microhydraulic system. He highlighted a series of small pistons. When you use your quirk, these braces will detect the bioelectric surge that precedes it. In that split second, the hydraulics will lock down, reinforcing the bone structure from the outside. They won't stop your bones from fracturing under a full power smash, but they will ensure the bones break cleanly, along predictable lines. They'll hold everything in place, preventing the limb from becoming, for lack of a better term, a bag of shattered marble. Deku looked at the design, his mind reeling. Tony Stark hadn't built him a weapon. He had built him a high-tech recovery system for an injury he was fully expecting Deku to inflict upon himself. He wasn't being geared up to win a fight. He was being geared up to be a disposable cannon. The thought was deeply, profoundly chilling. It's a purely defensive measure, Tony finished, seemingly oblivious to Deku's internal crisis. Designed to mitigate the inevitable self-destruction. We can't give you control, but we can at least put a guardrail on the cliff you keep throwing yourself off. Tony, Rhodey said, his voice tight. You've built a piece of equipment based on the assumption that this kid is going to cripple himself. I'm a realist, Rhodey, Tony shot back. He is going to cripple himself. This just makes it a manageable, reusable form of crippling. The casual brutality of the statement hung in the air. Deku felt a flush of shame and anger. He wasn't a tool. He was a person. A hero in training. But what could he say? Tony Stark had saved him, given him a place to stay. He owed him. He had agreed to help. He had given his word. The conversation was interrupted by the swish of the lab door. A new figure entered, moving with a silent, predatory grace that immediately put Deku on high alert. It was a woman with fiery red hair, dressed in practical, tactical gear. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and her eyes seemed to see everything. Natasha Romanoff? The Black Widow. She took in the scene with a quick, sweeping glance. Tony and Rhodey's tense standoff, Vision's quiet observation, and Deku, the scared-looking boy at the center of it all. "Stark," she said, her voice smooth and even. "Fury's been trying to reach you. Something about you requisitioning a Quinjet for a team-building exercise in Germany. Tell him I'll send a postcard," Tony said dismissively. Natasha's gaze lingered on Deku. Unlike Tony's scientific curiosity or Rhodey's military concern, her look was something else entirely. It was a look of recognition. She saw past the power, past the strange costume, and saw the core of him, a child, being polished and prepared for a battlefield. It was a look that said, "I know what they're turning you into. I've been there." Later that day, she found him. He was in the compound's empty training room, a vast space with padded mats and advanced gym equipment. He wasn't training. He was just standing in the middle of the room, staring at his hands, lost in thought. "They're building you a fancy cage for your power," she said, her voice startling him. He spun around to see her leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. It's a support brace," he corrected weakly. "It's a leash," she countered, walking towards him. Her movements were fluid, economical. "A way for Stark to point you at a problem and pull the trigger, knowing the gun won't completely fall apart in his hand." Deku stiffened. "Mr. Stark is trying to help. He's trying to prevent a bigger fight. He believes in accountability." "Tony believes in control," Natasha corrected gently. "His control. He's so terrified of the future, he's willing to burn the present to the ground to stop it from happening. And right now, you're his favorite match." She stopped in front of him, her expression uncharacteristically soft. She wasn't interrogating him. She was warning him. "I grew up in the Red Room," she said, her voice low. "They took little girls and turned them into weapons. They taught us how to kill, how to lie, how to be whatever they needed us to be. They pointed us at targets, and we never asked why. We just pulled the trigger. Because that's what we were." Deku stared at her, seeing the deep, ancient pain behind her guarded eyes. He was seeing the person, not the hero. "Stark is not the Red Room," she continued. "He doesn't want to hurt you. But he's desperate. And desperate men use whatever tools are at their disposal. Right now, that's you." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "So I'm not going to try and sway you to our side. I'm not going to tell you that Steve is right and Tony is wrong. But I am going to ask you one question, and I want you to think about it. When you get to that airport, and Tony points you at Captain America and says, 'Punch him,' do you know why you're punching? Not his reason. Your reason." The question landed like a physical blow. Deku had been so caught up in the abstract principles, law, order, accountability, and the overwhelming pressure of his situation that he hadn't truly considered the personal cost. He was being asked to fight Captain America. A hero. A legend. Natasha saw the conflict warring in his eyes. She had planted the seed. That was all she could do. "Just be careful, kid," she said, turning to leave. "In our line of work, the first casualty is always certainty." She left him alone in the vast, empty room, the silence now filled with the echo of her question. "Do you know why you're punching?" He thought back to his world, to the core tenets of being a hero as taught by All Might. A hero saves people. A hero inspires hope. A hero stops villains. The lines were so clear, so bright. Here, the lines were blurred into a murky, indistinguishable gray. There were no villains in this fight, only heroes on opposing sides. He spent the rest of the day in a state of turmoil. He tried on the new support braces. They were masterpieces of engineering, fitting over his arms and legs with a satisfying hiss of hydraulics. They felt heavy, not with physical weight, but with the weight of expectation. They were a promise of violence. Ultimately, his decision came down to a simple, flawed piece of logic. He had given his word to Tony Stark. In a world where he had nothing, Stark had offered him a lifeline. To back out now would be a betrayal. And more than that, the principle remained. Heroes needed rules. All Might, for all his power, operated within the law. Captain America, in Deku's limited understanding, was choosing not to. Therefore, Captain America was in the wrong. It was a simplistic, black and white view of a deeply complex situation, but it was the only framework he had. He would help Tony. He would go to Germany. He would be the deterrent Tony wanted him to be. He would stand for accountability, because he believed that was what All Might would want. That evening, he stood with Tony, Rhodey, and Vision on the tarmac, the sleek form of a Quinjet waiting for them. Natasha was there too, her expression neutral. She had made her choice, and it was to go with Tony, for now. A young man with a robotic spider suit was also there, bouncing on the balls of his feet with nervous energy. He was introduced as Peter Parker. Deku, clad in his repaired hero costume and the heavy, new braces, felt a pang of something odd as he looked at this Peter Parker. There was a strange resonance, a feeling of a path not taken. He shook it off. "You ready, kid?" Tony asked, clapping a hand on his shoulder. The hand felt heavy. Deku looked at the Quinjet, a vessel that would carry him to a battle against heroes. He thought of Natasha's question. "Do you know why you're punching?" "I'm doing this," he told himself, forcing conviction into his heart, "because it's the right thing to do. Because heroes have to follow the rules." He nodded, his expression grim and determined. "I'm ready." As he stepped onto the ramp of the Quinjet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't a hero gearing up for a grudge match. He was a bullet being loaded into a gun, aimed at the heart of the very ideal he had sworn his life to uphold. The flight to Germany was a low, rumbling drone that vibrated through the floor of the Quinjet and into Deku's very bones. He sat strapped into a seat in the cargo hold, a section of the aircraft that was all function and no comfort. The walls were a lattice of exposed piping and gray, metallic struts. His companions were a silent, tense collection of immense power. Across from him, Vision sat perfectly still, his cape draped over his seat, his glowing eyes closed as if in meditation. He was a portrait of serene cosmic power. Colonel Rhodes, now fully encased in his bulky war machine armor, ran weapons diagnostics on his gauntlet display, his face a mask of grim professionalism. Peter Parker, the new kid in the spider suit, was a bundle of nervous energy, fiddling with his web shooters and muttering to himself. And then there was Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow, who sat sharpening a combat knife with a whetstone, her movements economical and precise, her gaze distant and unreadable. Deku felt like a foreign object, a piece of driftwood caught in a current of immense, historical forces he couldn't begin to understand. He was the only one not wearing a helmet or a mask, his face bare to the sterile, recycled air. He clutched his notebook in his lap, the pages filled with analyses of heroes who didn't exist in this reality, a useless codex for a forgotten world. He kept replaying Natasha's question in his head. "Do you know why you're punching?" He had his answer, the one he'd constructed from the fragments of his own heroic code. To uphold the law. To promote accountability. To stop heroes from becoming unchecked vigilantes. It sounded noble. It sounded like something All Might would approve of. But the closer they got to their destination, the more hollow and fragile it felt. He was about to fight Captain America, a man his own world considered a paragon of heroism, a foundational myth. The dissonance was a physical sickness in his stomach. Tony Stark's voice crackled over the comms from the cockpit. "All right, team, listen up. We're 5 minutes out from Leipzig-Halle Airport. Steve's there. So is the Winter Soldier. Intel says he's got Wilson and Maximoff with him. Maybe more. This is a retrieval mission, not a demolition derby. We contain, we de-escalate, we bring them in. Our primary objective is to stop them from getting to that Quinjet on the far runway." He paused, his voice turning more serious. "This is going to get messy. They're not going to come quietly. Be prepared for resistance, but I want you to pull your punches. These are still our friends. We want to win them over, not put them in the hospital. The irony of that statement, directed at a team that included a boy whose only effective punch could level a building, was not lost on Deku. His heart hammered against his ribs. Midoriya! Tony's voice singled him out. You're the wild card. Stay out of sight until I call you in. You're my big green surprise package. Don't open it until I say so. Got it? Why yes, sir. Deku managed to stammer, his throat dry. The Quinjet banked sharply, and through a small porthole, Deku saw it, the Leipzig-Halle airport. It was a sprawling complex of glass and steel, eerily empty. The entire facility had been evacuated. It was a sterile, private battlefield, prepared just for them. The sight of it made the whole situation sickeningly real. This wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a planned confrontation. The rear ramp of the Quinjet lowered with a hydraulic hiss, flooding the hold with the cool, gray light of a German afternoon. The air smelled of jet fuel and rain. Go time! Tony's voice commanded. War Machine, Vision, Black Widow, and Spider-Man moved out, a coordinated unit of immense power and skill. Deku remained behind in the shadows of the jet, his orders clear. He watched them stride onto the tarmac, a formidable line of armor, synthetics, and raw human talent. Across the airfield, another group emerged from the main terminal. At their head was the unmistakable figure of Captain America, his iconic shield gleaming on his arm. Flanking him were Sam Wilson, the Falcon, with his mechanical wings folded behind him, Wanda Maximoff, her hands crackling with faint red energy, a stoic, dark-haired man with a metal arm, the Winter Soldier, and a man with a bow, Hawkeye. The two teams faced each other across the empty expanse, a pantheon of modern gods ready to go to war over a principle. Deku, watching from the shadows, felt a profound sense of wrongness. This was a family about to tear itself apart, and he was the stranger who'd been handed a weapon and told to pick a side. He couldn't hear the words they exchanged, but he could read the body language. Tony Stark, his helmet retracted, gestured, pleaded, reasoned. Steve Rogers stood firm, his posture unyielding, a man who had planted his feet and refused to be moved. The conversation grew more heated. The tension became a palpable thing, a static charge in the air, and then it broke. The first move came from Hawkeye. An arrow, tipped with some kind of EMP device, shot towards Iron Man. Vision phased through it effortlessly. And then chaos erupted. The airfield became a blur of motion and violence. War Machine's repulsors fired, not to kill, but to herd. Falcon's wings deployed as he soared into the sky. Black Widow engaged Hawkeye in a dizzying display of hand-to-hand combat. Spider-Man, all quips and acrobatic leaps, tried to ensnare Captain America in webs. Deku watched, his analytical mind kicking into overdrive despite his fear. He saw the patterns, the strategies. Team Iron Man was focused on containment, using non-lethal force to subdue and capture. Team Cap was focused on escape, creating diversions, fighting a desperate running battle towards their target Quinjet. He saw Spider-Man, a kid probably not much older than him, swinging through the air with a grace and precision that was breathtaking. Mobility quirk? No, Mr. Stark said it was tech. Web shooters. Incredible spatial awareness. Acrobatic fighting style focuses on incapacitation and misdirection. He's a perfect counter to a ground-based brawler like Captain America. He saw Vision phase through a car thrown by Wanda, his control over his own density absolute. Intangibility. Flight. Energy projection. His power levels are off the charts. Why isn't he ending this? Restraint. He's holding back, just as Mr. Stark ordered. The fight was a beautiful, terrifying dance of immense power, carefully restrained. But Team Cap was resilient. They were veterans, fighting with the desperation of cornered animals. They were making headway, pushing back against Stark's forces. Then came the signal. Okay, Underoos! Tony's voice crackled over the comms, a new note of strain in it. The casual nickname for Spider-Man was a jarring contrast to the escalating violence. He's all yours! Spider-Man swung in, snatching Captain America's shield with a web line and binding his hands. He landed on a luggage container, holding the shield aloft. Hey everyone, he said, his voice high with adrenaline. It was a key moment, a turning point. And then, another figure emerged from Team Cap's side, a man Deku hadn't seen before. "You have a big guy?" Sam Wilson asked over the comms. "We have a big guy," the man fiddled with his belt. And then he began to grow. And grow. And grow. He didn't stop at 10 feet, or 20. He kept expanding, his form swelling, ripping through his own suit. He grew to a colossal 65 feet, a giant in a red and black helmet, towering over the entire airfield. The ground shook with his every movement. The dynamic of the fight shifted instantly. Team Iron Man, who had been focused on containing individuals, were now like ants facing a boot. "Holy shit!" Tony's voice exclaimed, for once losing his cool composure. Giant Man swiped a hand at War Machine, who dodged just in time, the wind from the blow sending him tumbling through the air. He backhanded Spider-Man, sending the young hero flying into a jet bridge. He was a force of nature, an unstoppable, chaotic element that had shattered all of Tony's careful strategies. Deku watched in horror from the Quinjet. The carefully controlled disagreement had just escalated into a life-or-death struggle. He saw War Machine get swatted from the sky, his arc reactor failing, and plummet towards the ground. He saw Iron Man and Vision struggling to even slow the giant down. The plan was failing. People were going to get hurt. Seriously hurt. And then he heard the voice in his ear, no longer strained, but filled with a cold, hard desperation. "Okay, kid! Green Bunny! Whatever your name is! I need you to hit him! One big one! Put him down!" This was it. The moment the braces had been built for. The reason he was there. His heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of his chest. He looked at the chaos, at the heroes fighting heroes, at the giant tearing apart the airport. He saw his new acquaintances, the people who had given him a room and food, in genuine danger. Natasha's voice echoed in his memory. "Do you know why you're punching?" He did. Not for the Accords. Not for Tony Stark's political maneuvering. He was punching to save people. Right here, right now. It was the simplest, purest distillation of the hero's creed. It was the only reason that mattered. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and fear. He channeled the lessons of his predecessors, the faint, ghostly whispers of the power that resided within him. He crouched low, the support braces on his legs whining as they preemptively tensed. One for all. 100%. He didn't run. He leaped. The force of his jump shattered the reinforced metal ramp of the Quinjet, leaving a spiderweb of buckled steel. He wasn't a green blur, he was a cannonball. He shot across the airfield in a single, tremendous bound, covering hundreds of feet in a second. He landed on the tarmac halfway to the battle, and the impact was an explosion in itself. The concrete cratered beneath his feet, radiating cracks in every direction. The sound of his landing was a sharp crack that cut through the din of the battle. Every single person on the battlefield, both sides, stopped. The fighting ceased. The chaos paused. All eyes, human, synthesized, and giant, turned to the source of the noise. There, in the center of a newly formed crater, stood a boy in a green rabbit costume. He was small, unassuming, and looked utterly out of place. Green energy, like contained lightning, crackled around him, a visible aura of terrifying power. "Who's this?" Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, asked, his voice flat with confusion. Captain America stared, his shield held defensively. "I don't know. He's with me." Tony's voice came over the comms, grim and resolved. Deku didn't look at them. He didn't look at Captain America or Iron Man. His eyes were locked on the giant figure of Scott Lang, who was staring down at him with a mixture of confusion and alarm. This was his target. This was the threat he had to neutralize. He didn't waste a second. He pushed off again, another ground-shattering leap that carried him right to the feet of the giant. He began to run, not on the ground, but up Giant Man's leg, his feet finding purchase on the durable fabric of the suit. He was an ant climbing a mountain, a green comet streaking towards its target. "Whoa, whoa, hey! Get off me!" Scott Lang's booming voice echoed across the field. He tried to swat Deku off, but Deku was too fast, too small, too determined. He dodged a swipe from a hand the size of a bus, using the momentum to propel himself further up, onto the giant's torso. He scrambled up his chest, past the giant regulator dial, heading straight for the face. That was the weak point. Always the head. He reached the giant's shoulder, planted his feet, and looked Giant Man in the eye. He could see the man's normal-sized eyes, wide with panic, through the red lenses of his helmet. For a fleeting second, he saw a person, not a monster. A man who was probably just as scared as he was. I'm sorry, he thought. But I have to end this. He drew back his right arm, the arm encased in the sleek, dark green brace Tony Stark had built for him. The green lightning of One for All, which had been flickering around his body, now converged, funneling into that single limb. It was no longer a crackling aura. It was a raging, contained sun. The air around his fist began to distort with the sheer energy he was gathering. The support brace whined, its internal mechanisms straining under a load they were never truly designed to withstand. He could feel the power welling up, a force far beyond anything he had ever tried to control. It was the full, undiluted legacy of 8 generations of heroes, a power meant to save the world, now focused into a single, devastating point. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of exertion, of desperation, of a boy pushing himself past every conceivable limit. The cry was lost in the sound of the power itself, a noise like a star being born. Detroit. He pivoted his body, putting every ounce of his weight, every iota of his will, into the blow. Smash! His fist connected with the side of Giant Man's helmet. The world went white. It was not a punch. It was a cataclysm. The impact didn't just strike its target. It created a shockwave, a visible dome of concussive force that erupted from the point of contact. The sound was not a crack or a boom. It was a physical event, a brutal tear in the fabric of the atmosphere that hit everyone on the field like a solid wall. Giant Man's head snapped to the side with impossible violence. The lenses of his helmet shattered, and the entire 65-foot form went rigid then slack. He didn't just get knocked out. He was switched off, the colossal body suddenly devoid of life. He began to fall, not forward or backward, but straight down, a collapsing mountain of flesh and bone. But the punch's effect did not end there. The shockwave radiated outwards, a circle of pure destruction. It ripped across the airfield with the force of a hurricane. The luggage containers that littered the field were not pushed. They were launched, tumbling end over end like children's toys. The smaller jets parked on the tarmac were lifted from their moorings, their wings buckling, their fuselages groaning. Every window in the distant airport terminal, hundreds of yards away, shattered simultaneously, a cascade of glittering glass. The heroes, both teams, were blasted off their feet. Iron Man's flight stabilizers screamed as he fought to stay airborne. Captain America was thrown back 20 feet, his shield the only thing that kept him from being shattered. Hawkeye and Black Widow, Wanda and Bucky, they were all sent flying, skidding across the tarmac like stones on a pond. The battlefield was cleared in a single, indiscriminate blast of raw, untamed power. The giant body of Scott Lang hit the ground with a tremor that shook the entire airport, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. And then silence. A profound, ringing, deafening silence. The only sound was the faint, pathetic tinkling of falling glass from the distant terminal and the low groan of stressed metal. The fight was over. Instantly. Utterly. In the ringing silence, all eyes, bleary and disoriented, turned to the source of the devastation. Deku was on his knees, perched on the now fallen giant's shoulder. His body was shaking violently. The green lightning was gone. The aura of power had vanished. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped. Slowly, he lifted his right arm, or what was left of it. The StarkTech brace was a wreck, twisted and blackened, shards of its carbon polymer shell jutting out at odd angles. Smoke curled from its ruined hydraulics. And the arm within, it was a nightmare. It was a mangled, grotesque ruin, bent at an angle that defied human anatomy. The skin was a deep, horrifying spectrum of purple, black, and red, swollen to twice its normal size. Bone, sharp and white, had pierced the skin in several places. It was not an arm anymore. It was an abstract sculpture of pain and destruction. He didn't scream. The pain was too immense, too absolute for a sound like that. It was a low, agonized keen, a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering that was more chilling than any scream. He cradled the ruined limb with his good hand, tears streaming down his face, his body convulsing with silent, racking sobs of agony. Steve Rogers was the first to find his voice. He pushed himself to his feet, his ears ringing, his body bruised. He stared at the boy, at the horrifying, self-inflicted wound, at the apocalyptic aftermath of his single punch. He looked across the ruined battlefield to where Iron Man was hovering, his gold faceplate impassive. The disgust in Captain America's voice was a palpable thing, colder and sharper than any weapon on the field. "Tony, what did you do?" It wasn't a question of strategy. It wasn't an accusation of betrayal. It was a moral indictment. "He's a child." Tony Stark, hovering in the air, looked down at the scene. He saw the unconscious giant. He saw the neutralized threat. He saw the path to the Quinjet was now clear for Steve and Bucky. He had technically lost the battle. But all he could really see was Deku. He saw the boy on his knees, weeping in agony. He saw the arm he had sacrificed. He saw the look on his face just before the punch, not of anger or malice, but of desperate, heroic resolve. He had brought a nuke to a fistfight. And it had detonated exactly as planned. The victory he had sought, the containment he had preached, was achieved at the cost of a child's body and soul. The look on Captain America's face wasn't anger. It was a profound, bottomless disappointment that was somehow 1,000 times worse. Tony had proven Steve's point for him. In his desperation for control, Tony Stark had become the very thing he feared, an unchecked power, willing to sacrifice anything, and anyone, for his vision of security. The victory was hollow. The air tasted of ash. And the cost was a screaming, broken boy, weeping on the shoulder of a fallen giant. The silence that followed the cataclysm was a living entity. It pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the low, agonized moans coming from the boy kneeling on the fallen giant's shoulder. The dust began to settle, revealing a landscape of utter devastation. The clean, orderly lines of the Leipzig-Halle airport had been brutally erased, replaced with the jagged, chaotic geometry of a disaster zone. On one side of the field, what was left of Team Cap slowly, painfully, picked themselves up. Sam Wilson, his falcon wings bent and sparking, rushed to Captain America's side. Clint Barton helped a dazed Wanda Maximoff to her feet, his face pale with shock. They all stared, not at their opponents, but at the small, green-clad figure who was the epicenter of the destruction. They were soldiers, spies, and enhanced individuals, no strangers to violence. But this was different. This was raw, untamed, and horrifyingly self-destructive. It wasn't the work of a soldier. It was the desperate act of a living weapon. On the other side, Team Iron Man was in a similar state of shock. Peter Parker, his spider suit torn, pulled his mask off, his young face wide-eyed with a mixture of awe and terror. Natasha Romanoff stood frozen, her usual unflappable composure completely shattered. Her gaze was fixed on Deku, and her expression was one of haunted recognition. She was seeing a ghost from her own past, a child conditioned to break themselves for a cause they barely understood. Tony Stark, hovering in his Iron Man suit, felt a cold dread creeping into his circuits, a feeling far worse than any battle damage. Steve's words echoed in his helmet, a repeating, damning indictment. He's a child. He had seen the numbers. He had run the simulations. He knew, intellectually, what a 100% output would do to the boy. But seeing it, hearing the sound of that agony, feeling the profound wrongness of it all, it was a different reality entirely. The abstract concept of a reusable form of crippling had just manifested as a broken, sobbing teenager. The truce, born of mutual shock, was broken by Captain America. He took a step forward, then another, his movements stiff. He wasn't moving toward Tony. He was moving toward Bucky, who was still on the ground, shaking his head to clear it. "Bucky," Steve said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to go." Now, this was their chance. Their objective, the second Quinjet, was unguarded. Their opponents were stunned, their secret weapon a casualty of his own power. Tony saw it happening, his tactical mind screaming at him to intercept, to stop them, to finish the mission. But he couldn't move. His thrusters wouldn't respond. He was locked in place by the sheer weight of what he had just unleashed. Vision, ever the pragmatist, was the first to recover. He phased into the air, his yellow cape billowing, and moved to intercept Captain America. "Captain Rogers," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I cannot allow you to leave. Get out of my way, Vision," Steve said, his voice dangerously even. "I will not," Vision replied, positioning himself between Steve's group and the waiting jet. "This has gone far enough." As Steve and Vision faced off, a new sound cut through the tension. It was the sound of Scott Lang, the giant man, groaning as he began to shrink, his colossal form rapidly deflating back to human size, leaving Deku to slump onto the tarmac. The fall, only a few feet, was enough to jostle his ruined arm. A fresh wave of agony ripped through him, and this time, a scream tore from his throat. It was a raw, ragged sound of pure torment that sliced through the air, sharp and terrible. That sound broke the spell. Every hero on that field, regardless of their side, flinched. It was the sound of unambiguous, undeniable suffering, and it cut through the politics, the accords, the personal vendettas. It was the sound of a kid in hell. Captain America, who had been about to charge Vision, froze. He looked over at the source of the scream. He saw the boy, now a small, crumpled heap on the asphalt, cradling an arm that looked like something from a butcher's shop. The righteous anger on Steve's face melted away, replaced by something far more profound, a wave of absolute, gut-wrenching horror. "Tony," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My God, what have you done?" Tony landed, his armor clanking on the pavement. He retracted his helmet, his face pale and slick with sweat. He couldn't meet Steve's eyes. He looked at Deku, at the consequence of his desperate calculus. The boy's whimpers were quieter now, devolving into hitched, painful gasps for air. The standoff was over. The fight had bled out of everyone. The price of this disagreement was laid bare for them all to see, and it was too high. Rhodey, his war machine suit dented and smoking, limped over to Tony. "Was it worth it?" he asked, his voice thick with accusation. Tony had no answer. He just stared at the broken boy who had trusted him. It was Wanda Maximoff who moved first. She walked slowly, cautiously, not towards her allies but towards Deku. The red energy that usually danced around her fingers was gone. Her expression was one of deep, empathetic pain. She, more than anyone, knew what it was like to wield a power that could hurt people, to be seen as a weapon. She knelt a few feet away from Deku, not touching him, but simply being present. "It hurts," she said softly, her Sokovian accent thick. "I know." Deku looked up, his tear-streaked face a mask of confusion and agony. He saw her, one of the enemies he was supposed to fight, and saw only compassion in her eyes. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. The moment was shattered by the whine of approaching sirens. The German authorities, held back until now, were finally moving in. "We're out of time," Natasha said, her voice sharp, pragmatic, cutting through the emotional haze. "Tony, we need to go. Now. We take the kid and we go." Tony snapped back to reality. He nodded, his movements jerky. "Right. The kid." He started to move toward Deku, but Steve Rogers stepped in his way. The captain's face was a thundercloud of judgment. "You're not touching him," Steve said, his voice like ice. "You've done enough." "He's my responsibility, Steve!" Tony shot back, a desperate edge to his voice. "He needs medical attention. My medical attention. What are you going to do? Take him to a German public hospital? How do you explain that?" He gestured wildly at Deku's mangled arm. "He's not a piece of equipment you get to reclaim after you break it, Tony." Steve's voice rose, filled with a fury that was all the more potent for its restraint. "Look at him. He's a child. You brought a child to a war and told him to self-destruct for you. It was a last resort. You brought a 60-foot giant to the party, and you brought a nuke. And you pushed the button." Their argument was a raw, open wound in the middle of the devastated airfield. The political had become brutally personal. This was no longer about the Accords. It was about a fundamental schism in their souls, a line Tony had crossed that Steve could never forgive. Deku, listening through a haze of pain, felt a fresh wave of despair. They were fighting about him. He was the problem. His power, his weakness, His very existence was the wedge driving these great heroes apart. He had wanted to help, to be a hero, but he had only made everything infinitely worse. He had become the catalyst for the very disaster he was supposed to prevent. "Please," he whispered, his voice so faint it was almost lost in the wind. "Please stop fighting." Both Tony and Steve fell silent, their angry words dying in their throats. They looked down at the boy, whose plea was not for himself, but for them. In that moment, he wasn't a weapon or a symbol of their failure. He was just a kid, caught in the crossfire of a battle between giants, begging them to remember who they were. The weight of that simple plea was heavier than any punch. Steve Rogers took a step back, the anger draining from him, leaving behind only a vast, weary sadness. He looked at Tony, and the disappointment in his eyes was like a physical blow. It was the look of a man seeing his friend become someone he no longer recognized. Without another word, he turned, helped Bucky to his feet, and with a final, sorrowful glance at the scene, led his remaining allies away, disappearing into the chaos of the approaching authorities. They let him go. No one tried to stop them. The Battle of Leipzig-Halle was over. There were no winners. Only casualties. The flight back to the compound was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than the one on the way out. This was the quiet of a funeral procession. It was thick with shame, guilt, and the unspoken acknowledgement of a terrible mistake. Deku was lying on a medical gurney in the back of the Quinjet, heavily sedated. The pain had been too much, a feedback loop of agony that was causing his vitals to fluctuate dangerously. Tony had administered a powerful tranquilizer, and the boy had finally succumbed to a restless, twitching unconsciousness. His ruined arm had been gently, carefully stabilized in a pneumatic cast, but even in his drugged sleep, he would occasionally whimper, his body tensing as phantom pains shot through his nervous system. Tony Stark sat beside the gurney, his Iron Man suit discarded, leaving him in a simple, oil-stained t-shirt. He hadn't stopped looking at Deku's face since they'd taken off. The kid looked so young, so vulnerable. The determined hero who had screamed, "Detroit Smash," was gone, replaced by a pale, fragile child. The numbers and simulations swirled in Tony's head. He had known the risks. He had calculated the probability of severe injury. But the data had been cold, sterile, devoid of the human element. Data couldn't account for the sound of a boy's scream, or the look of utter betrayal in Steve's eyes. He had treated a human being like an equation, and he had gotten his answer. And the answer was horror. Rhodey, strapped into a seat nearby, was also out of his armor. His leg was in a temporary brace, and his face was a grim mask of pain and anger. He hadn't spoken a word to Tony. He just stared out the window, the silence between them a chasm. Natasha was methodically cleaning her weapons, her hands steady, but her eyes were troubled. She kept glancing at Deku, then at Tony. She had warned him. She had asked the question, and now they all had to live with the answer. It was Peter Parker who finally broke the silence. He was huddled in a corner, his spider mask clutched in his hands. Is he going to be okay, Mr. Stark?" he asked, his voice small and shaky. His arm. Tony ran a hand over his face, the gesture weary and ancient. "I don't know, kid," he said, his voice rough. "I honestly don't know." He looked at Peter, at his wide, earnest, terrified eyes. This was the kid he should have been mentoring, the one he should have been protecting. Instead, he'd thrown him into the deep end, right alongside the kid he'd used as a depth charge. "You did good today, Peter," he said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. "You should be proud." Peter didn't look proud. He looked like he'd just seen something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "That punch," he whispered, more to himself than anyone. "I've never seen anything like it. It was terrifying." "Yeah," Tony said softly, his gaze returning to Deku. "It was." When they landed back at the compound, a full medical team was waiting. At its head was Dr. Helen Cho, the world-renowned geneticist whose regeneration cradle had been instrumental in creating Vision and healing Hawkeye after the Battle of Sokovia. Tony had called her from the Quinjet, his voice stripped of its usual bravado, pleading for her help. She took one look at Deku's arm as he was carefully wheeled off the jet, and her professional demeanor momentarily faltered. Her eyes widened in shock. "My God, Tony!" she breathed, looking from the mangled limb to Stark's haggard face. What happened? A disagreement, Tony said grimly. Can you fix him? Dr. Cho's face hardened as she switched back into doctor mode. Get him to the medbay now. I need a full biometric scan, neuroimaging, and get the cradle prepped. We're going to have to rebuild the entire limb from the cellular level up. Tony watched them wheel Deku away, the gurney disappearing down a pristine white corridor. He was left standing on the tarmac, the setting sun casting a long, lonely shadow behind him. The victory he had wanted, the capture of Captain America, had slipped through his fingers. He had lost his friend, fractured his team, and broken a child who had looked at him with nothing but heroic admiration. He walked, not to his lab, not to the bar, but to the compound's central control room. Friday, he said, his voice flat. Pull up all surveillance footage from the airport. All angles. The massive screen in front of him flickered to life, displaying a dozen different views of the battle. He watched it all. He watched his own pleading, his own arrogance. He watched Steve's stubborn defiance. He watched the first arrow fly, the first punch thrown. Then, he isolated the footage of Deku. He watched the boy's terrified hesitation in the Quinjet. He watched the moment his own desperate voice came over the comms. And he watched the transformation. He saw the resolve harden the boy's face. He saw him become a living embodiment of his power. He zoomed in on the final moment. The leap. The climb. The scream. The punch. Friday, he commanded, his voice hoarse. Isolate the boy's face. The instant before impact, the image on the screen zoomed in, pixelated for a moment, then sharpened into horrifying clarity. It was a face contorted in a mask of supreme effort and agony. But it was the eyes that held Tony captive. They were screwed shut, tears streaming from them, but they weren't squeezed shut in anger or hatred. They were squeezed shut in a kind of desperate, prayerful concentration. It was the face of a martyr, not a soldier. A boy sacrificing himself on an altar of his own making, for a cause he had been sold by a desperate, manipulative man. Tony Stark, the genius, the billionaire, the Iron Man, sank into a chair, put his head in his hands, and finally understood the true price of his single, calculated punch. He had won the battle for the airport, but in doing so, he had lost a fundamental part of himself. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was a price he would be paying for a very long time.